All right, let's just jump right in. Today we are diving into an explainer on one of the most fascinating paradoxes in modern history, Sigmund Freud. We're going to unpack this guy because, honestly, it's wild. He's largely been bypassed by modern medical science, yet he is absolutely foundational to our culture. It's a really incredible dynamic to explore because, well, whether you realize it or not, the way you think about your very own mind, it's been deeply, deeply shaped by this one man.
So that brings us to an immediate mystery, right? Why do modern psychiatrists get so frustrated the second you mention his clinical methods, but Netflix is still out there making hit shows about him? Just think about it for a second. Every single year, brand new books about his life hit the shelves. His name alone is practically a guarantee for publishers to generate sales and hype. So what's the deal? Is he just some relic of the past, or is he actually still relevant today?
And this perfectly highlights the ultimate contradiction we're looking at. See, while clinical medicine has evolved heavily since about 1950, moving toward neurobiology, brain chemistry, strict clinical data, the way we as ordinary people talk about our minds is still completely governed by Freud. Sure, his clinical theories might lack the strict scientific rigor we demand today, but culturally, the guy is a towering giant, absolutely massive. And to understand exactly how he achieved this monumental status, we really have to look closely at the man himself.
To figure out how he built this absolute empire of thought, we've got to look at four really contradictory pillars of his personality. And let's start with a curveball. He actually wanted to study philosophy, not medicine. Yeah, he was practically forced into medical school just because he got good grades and his family pushed him into a quote-unquote prestigious field. So he spent his early years basically trying to push the strict biological medicine he was forced to study toward the philosophical humanistic ideas he genuinely loved.
Now, what's truly fascinating here is how his deep, romantic love for poetry and theater completely shaped his science. He was convinced early on that dreams weren't just, random brain electricity, but profound messages hidden inside us. While studying medicine, he gets captivated by a public lecture on the poet Goethe. Later, he's watching Shakespeare's The Tempest in Vienna and hearing lines about dreams being the fabric of our lives. It just sparked something in him. He started theorizing that dreams are actually messages bubbling up from a dark, buried part of ourselves.
So, let's see how this philosophical mindset totally shapes his early career. It's a pretty chaotic journey. He goes from feeling completely alienated as a Jewish medical student in a deeply unwelcoming Vienna back in 1873 to this totally life-changing trip to Paris in 1885. In Paris, he studies under this famous neurologist, Charcot, who was actually using hypnosis to treat unexplained physical symptoms, what they called hysteria back then. Actually, seeing patients treated through the power of suggestion rather than traditional medicine, it completely blew Freud's mind and opened him up to a whole new frontier.
And here is where Freud makes his first massive leap. While his older, much wealthier colleague Joseph Breuer just thought traumatized patients were, zoning out or entering some dreamlike state during their traumas, Freud looked at it and pragmatically deduced, no, they are fully conscious, but they are actively burying their pain. He realized that a patient's unexplained paralysis or loss of speech was actually the mind hiding a horrific memory. It was an absolutely groundbreaking concept. He called it repression.
Now, this realization led him to make a bold move. He stubbornly abandoned all that flashy hypnosis stuff for a brand new technique he coined free association. Instead of dangling a pocket watch in front of someone's face, he would literally just sit and listen to patients for hours. He'd let their thoughts wander completely freely until they naturally stumbled upon those repressed memories and achieved what he called catharsis, a huge emotional release. Basically, he invented the talking cure right then and there.
Now, you might assume his monumental 1900 book, The Interpretation of Dreams, which laid out all of these amazing findings, was an instant smash hit, right? Nope. It was initially a massive commercial failure that left him completely isolated. His peers openly mocked him. His mentor, Breuer, totally abandoned him just to avoid the controversy. So here's Freud, in massive debt, newly married, and being treated like a complete joke by the entire medical establishment of Vienna.
But Freud was incredibly strategic. He brilliantly navigated his way around that hostile academic establishment by securing a professorship in 1902, which instantly gave him legal and academic cover. Then he starts building a loyal following right in his own living room at 14 Burggasse, hosting what became known as the Wednesday Psychological Society. He even formed a Verein, that's a German term for a club or association, specifically to entirely bypass the rigid oversight of those university peers who mocked him. Honestly, it was a masterful bit of pragmatic empire building.
As his influence started spreading like wildfire, he popularized the idea that our hidden desires are constantly leaking out, most famously through jokes and, of course, the Freudian slip. He argued that our mistakes and our word choices, they're rarely random. Like, if you accidentally call your boss mom, Freud would say, hold on, that's not just a linguistic glitch. To him, that was a tiny window swinging open into your subconscious, revealing a completely hidden dynamic.
And this obsession with hidden desires led to his absolute most famous framework, a theory of the mind as a divided battleground. He envisioned it being heavily dominated by the massive, hidden, instinctual id, which is then constantly policed by our conscious ego and that nagging, guilt-inducing superego. Think about it. This model gave ordinary people an entirely new, incredibly visual way to understand why they felt so conflicted all the time. It finally explained the crushing weight of guilt and the totally irresistible pull of desire.
But as psychoanalysis expanded globally, things got messy. His incredibly rigid focus on childhood sexuality began causing major rifts in his inner circle. Freud insisted that repressed sexual instincts were the absolute root of all neuroses, period, and this rigidness led brilliant protégés like Carl Jung, who believed in a much broader collective unconscious, and Alfred Adler, who focused more on feelings of inferiority, to fundamentally disagree with him and break away entirely.
And Jung's departure? Wow, that wasn't just a minor professional disagreement. The sheer dramatic weight of that betrayal was massive. It was easily the greatest professional heartbreak of Freud's life. See, Freud had actually positioned Jung to be the president of his international association, partly because Jung wasn't Jewish, which Freud pragmatically thought would help psychoanalysis avoid anti-Semitic bias in Europe. So when Jung left, man, it devastated Freud deeply.
Following this brutal betrayal, Freud's own life takes a deeply dark turn. He faces a relentless wave of personal and global tragedies that would seriously test his incredible persistence. First, World War I completely devastates the economy, wiping out the wealth of the middle-class patients who actually paid for his sessions. Then, the horrific Spanish flu claims the life of his absolute favorite daughter, Sophie. And if that wasn't enough, shortly after, Freud is diagnosed with severe jaw cancer, which required dozens of agonizing surgeries.
Living through all this, watching traumatized soldiers return from World War I, just endlessly reliving their nightmares, and even observing his own grandson repetitively play a game about loss, Freud theorized a dark new concept, the death drive. He realized, you know what, we aren't just driven by a desire for pleasure, we also have this dark subconscious compulsion towards self-destruction, a need to aggressively repeat our own traumas. It was a really bleak but profoundly influential shift in his philosophy.
Then, in 1933, the rise of the Nazi regime brings a completely new set of horrors. To put the scale of it in perspective, students burned 25,000 books, specifically targeting Freud's works for being Jewish and quote-unquote un-German. 25,000. It was a terrifying sign of what was to come. But despite all his friends literally begging him to leave Vienna, Freud stubbornly refused, insisting he still had patients to see and writing to do.
These terrifying events all culminated in his final years. Despite facing severe harassment, the stubborn old doctor absolutely refused to stop seeing his patients until 1938. That was the year the Nazis fully occupied Vienna, raided his home, and even briefly detained his daughter Anna. Finally, forced to pay an enormous ransom, he fled his beloved home at 14 Berggasse and escaped to London. Sadly, he passed away in exile just a year later, in 1939. But ultimately, his legacy, it is inescapable. Every single time you use words like projection or repression, or any time you imagine a patient talking on a therapist's couch, you are literally living inside the world that Freud engineered. I mean, before him, the image of a doctor sitting quietly with a pipe while a patient lay on a couch simply did not exist. He literally gave us the very language we use to analyze ourselves and each other.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. Even if medical science continues to outgrow his specific clinical methods, can humanity ever truly separate our understanding of ourselves from the romantic poet who mapped the subconscious? As biographer Joel Whitebook brilliantly pointed out, even when Freud was wrong, he was deeply inspiring. He forever changed the way we view the human experience, and honestly, that is a legacy worth remembering. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Catch you next time.